Sabine Hossenfelder recently made a video about the downsides of government-funded science and how science might be privately funded in the future. In her video, Sabine argues that academia is basically funded by the same method as a communist economy. As a result, people who have no skin in the game are the ones who decide where the money goes, leading to drastic misallocation of funds. Today, I'm going to explain how the situation is actually far worse than this. Government-funded science systematically uses force to entrench the mainstream at the cost of revolutionary ideas, causing stagnation. Let's find out what we can do to break that stagnation here on Inductica. So how does government funding of science cause stagnation? Well, consider the bureaucrats who are charged with making selections for government grants. Would you want such a person to be informed about the science he's making selections in? Of course you would. The opposite would be madness. Now, let's say an individual looked at a bunch of proposals in theoretical physics. Say he looked at string theory, loop quantum gravity, and let's say the ether approach, advocated by me and some of my esteemed colleagues. Now, let's imagine that he uses his own independent, educated scientific judgment and is convinced by our arguments that the ether is the best way forward in physics. If this happened, there would be an enormous uproar. He would be accused of being biased, of giving a disproportionate amount of the funding to a tiny minority of scientists just because he happened to agree with them. Now, on some level, this uproar would be right. He's giving out public funds that are not rightfully his, to research which conforms to his personal opinions. So in order to be objective and unbiased, he's going to have to allot funding based on proportionality, based on how many scientists there are with each different point of view. This works to entrench the status quo over time. Research projects which are a part of the consensus are therefore more likely to be funded, and research projects which are unpopular are rejected merely for being unpopular. As a result of this, academics are incentivized to continue publishing papers according to the consensus. Since bureaucrats have to be unbiased and go with that consensus, the Galileos among us, the ones who uncompromisingly challenge the status quo and could bring us life-changing discoveries, often lose their funding. This is a form of censorship, not one where fringe opinions are outlawed, but where mainstream opinions are subsidized. This damages the central tool of scientific inquiry, the objective, unbiased judgment of the mind. As a result, young scientists in academia experience the opposite of what brought them to the sciences, a vision of the uncompromised, fearless pursuit of truth. And this was definitely the case during my sentence in academia. To get my master's thesis, I studied philosophical issues in quantum mechanics. During my investigations, I studied quantum entanglement deeply and came up with a good argument that it constitutes a faster-than-light action. During my thesis defense, the physicists on my thesis committee told me that my argument was absurd. I asked them what part of my argument was in error, and their response was simply to say, "So you think you're smarter than Einstein?" I responded by saying that they couldn't reject my argument if they didn't have a counter-argument. They responded by saying, "We don't have to give you your master's degree." To which I responded, "Well, if you're just going to threaten me, I'm not sure what to say." Now, on a side note, in my more considered, mature judgment today, I'm actually still making up my mind on quantum entanglement. My point in this story is not that I was right, but consider this. I gave a good argument, an argument that they were unable to answer, and they simply scoffed at it because it was outside of the mainstream. This is the kind of unscientific attitude that is rewarded by the current system we have, not punished as it should be. To cover their asses in both directions, they ended up passing me, but only on the condition that I add more mainstream physics to my presentation. They required me to add chapters 7 and 8 to my thesis, which is a survey of prior research, which is irrelevant to the point I make in the paper. And these 3 months I spent defacing my paper are a microcosm of all of academia. Independent minds have to spend time on work that they don't think is important in order to conform to the status quo so that they can get funded. According to a survey that Sabine cites, 78% of scientists would fundamentally change their research direction if they could do so while keeping their funding. So my situation where I was doing work that didn't matter to me, work that I didn't think conformed to my scientific opinions, this is an ordinary situation in academia. Through this process of giving in day by day, bit by bit to these perverse incentives, as I did to get my master's degree, this creates a mindset in academics which puts other people's opinions ahead of the facts. As one example of this, I had a discussion with this one philosopher of science when I was in grad school. It was when I suddenly discovered the following. I said, did you know there are theories of gravity that are consistent with all the observations, just like general relativity, but they don't actually involve the bending of space and time? Now, I was really excited about this because it showed that there was maybe some other theory that was correct. If there are multiple theories that line up with all the observations, it means that general relativity isn't necessarily true. And to this, I was met with jaded indifference. The professor said, yeah, I know, people have worked on that, but the fact is general relativity has been around for a really long time and it's an accepted theory. So imagine that. A philosopher of science was completely unconcerned with the fact that general relativity is not a proven theory, that there may be a different theory out there, which is also consistent with the observations, but one that's actually correct, one that gives us a clearer picture of reality. But imagine the fact that he doesn't care about it because most people just won't accept it. This is a man who had forgotten what it's like to be the kid who was in front of him, me, at the time. An idealistic mind excited by a doorway into new discoveries. And over the years, what I've found is that even when people do challenge the status quo, they often do so in a timid, muted kind of way. John Bell, the man who discovered quantum entanglement, strongly suspected that his phenomenon indeed constituted a faster-than-light causal process, just as I did. But he timidly advocated for this position. Now, the reason it's considered absurd that entanglement might constitute a faster-than-light action is because under the framework of special relativity, in the subjective reality of certain observers in certain reference frames, cause and effect actually goes backwards in time if any given action travels faster than the speed of light. Now, this fact actually led Bell to become skeptical of the theory of relativity and made him start to entertain a Lorentz ether theory. In the view of a Lorentz ether theory, which is an alternative to special relativity, this apparent backwards in time causation is actually an artifact of special relativity's ludicrous assumption that light travels at the same speed in all reference frames. In a Lorentz ether theory, light goes at a constant speed with respect to the ether, not the same speed for all observers. So a faster-than-light action does not go back in time, according to a Lorentz ether view. For this reason, Bell published an elegant paper explaining Lorentz ether theory. However, he titled the paper, "How to Teach Special Relativity," stating that his intention was only to present a simpler way to teach special relativity. This kind of behavior is emblematic of thinkers who are acting under censorship. Fearing retribution from the church, Copernicus published his heliocentric theory posthumously. And to avoid persecution himself, one of the men who published the work of Copernicus actually added a foreword to the book that this heliocentric model was merely a mathematical description of appearances, not a theory of the true nature of the heavens. Now, this stagnation is even worse in academic philosophy. If you've actually ever tried reading philosophy papers that are published in journals, you'll find that they're poorly written. They use long, unclear sentences loaded with unexplained jargon. They do this because they're not writing for a customer. They're not writing for someone who actually needs the information. Instead, they're writing for other academics in order to gain their approval and secure funding from the consensus. They are unconcerned if their ethics papers are useless for helping people live better lives, or if their epistemology papers are unreadable by scientists who need guidance in the scientific method. They simply aren't judged by the actual people who need philosophical wisdom. So if that's the case, why would they take the painstaking effort required to communicate philosophical abstractions to some kind of end user? And for a related reason, most philosophy papers are pointless. They are not written to advance mankind's understanding on some fundamental issue or to impart wisdom to some kind of end user. They are written to avoid criticism and to pass committees. In order to avoid criticism, philosophers often avoid writing about any fundamental issues, confining themselves only to commentary on past philosophers, or writing on subjects that are so niche that they can't possibly be of use or disagreement to anyone. Further, since the committees approving these papers don't represent the interests of people who are actually paying for the work, they have no incentive to reject papers which will never be read by anyone beyond them. So I've given examples from the fields of physics and philosophy, since those are the fields that I have firsthand experience in. But these bad incentives are going to have an influence on all of the fields that governments subsidize. Now, note that I'm not saying that all academic philosophy and science is useless. I'm saying that this incentive structure is causing drastic underperformance. And the root cause of this underperformance is that research is being funded by force, and force is anti-mind. When the government forces you to pay for research through taxes, you aren't allowed to use your own mind to decide where to allocate that money. And in order to be fair, bureaucrats also aren't allowed to use their minds either. They can't use their own independent judgments to actually allocate the capital. As a result, we can see that force has removed independent judgment from the sciences from the top down. Imagine if investors in tech weren't allowed to use their own independent judgment when investing in startups. Imagine if they had to make decisions based on the consensus in the field. If that were the case, then the tech boom, which was led by disruptive innovators, simply never would have happened. The real tragedy of this situation is that we have no idea what we've missed out on. How many great ideas have perished at the hands of this system? We'll never know. The solution, as Sabine hesitantly admits, is a free market, privately funded research system. In contrast to an anti-mind system like we have now, a free market, privately funded system is pro-mind. In such a system, private investors are able to make their own rational judgments about which projects to fund and which to ignore. Now, let me respond to the usual objections against funding research privately. One of the objections goes like this. If we funded research privately, wouldn't all abstract fundamental research disappear? Wouldn't private research only be done by corporations for some immediate application and never for fundamental discovery? Absolutely not. People love science and they want to see more of it. If you watch my channel, then you're probably one of these people. One of these people who get spiritual fuel from witnessing the new scientific insights and discoveries that I present on my channel. Some of you even support me on Patreon. As people around the world grow richer and more educated, this pool of upper and middle class science lovers will only grow larger, giving us a greater pool for privately funded science. Now, another objection is, if we had privately funded science, wouldn't a lot of it be based on the faulty scientific judgment of certain individuals who were just sucked in by charlatans who wanted to fund science but just got convinced by the wrong people? Now, it's true that a lot of privately funded ventures would be stupid, but what makes you think that someone would have good judgment just because they're in the government? There will always be those people with poor scientific judgments who reward bad science, but in a free system, those who do have what it takes to find new facts will be free to make their case without having to bow to the status quo. When people are free to judge for themselves, better decisions will be more common. Finally, when donors waste their money on charlatans, they will only be hurting themselves in a privately funded system. They will not be able to make you pay for it. In a private system, philosophers would be paid according to the value that they actually added for consumers. They wouldn't just be paid in accordance with how much other philosophers approved of them. They would be incentivized to write clearly, to deliver their wisdom to an actual end user. And they would be incentivized to give people answers to deep fundamental questions that people need answers to in their lives, instead of simply commenting on what past philosophers have said on endless repeat. Philosophers would have to motivate their abstractions by connecting them to things that people care about, instead of pursuing topics that please other academics. Epistemologists like me would have to show that their ideas were actually useful to a scientist. And further, philosophers would actually be rewarded for going outside the status quo and identifying answers. Identifying better ways to live and better ways to do science would be rewarded by donors, while projects based on useless trivium would simply never get funding. Now, this is not some kind of idle fever dream. A free market system of this kind is already forming. The internet has given us an unprecedented ability to communicate, matching promising talent and ideas with donors who are hungry for new ideas and scientific progress. As a few examples of such intellectuals, Alex Epstein started the Center for Industrial Progress, which is a for-profit think tank in the field of industrial policy. Gene Moroney of Thinking Directions maneuvered around government restrictions on psychological help by giving classes and coaching sessions online. Scott Powell got around the government lockdown on education by teaching history to homeschool kids, teaching them online according to his own theory of history. And here at Inductica, I enjoy the donations of supporters on Patreon, and I make a living by tutoring students online based on my own standards of education. Now consider this. I can tell you that many of my college students are not attending their unclear physics lectures and are instead learning from YouTube, or if they can afford it, they're learning physics from tutors like me. Physics professors who have no incentive to lecture clearly will soon be obsolete as better educational products online become cheaper and more effective through a process of free market competition. Incidentally, if you're confused in your physics classes, I have a special way of filling the gaps in your physics education so that you're actually able to connect your professor's disconnected math to reality and actually learn from his lectures. With just one session a week, all of your professor's floating abstractions can start to make sense. So just go to inductica.org/contact if you'd like to schedule a tutoring session. So not only are there educational entrepreneurs like me, there's already YouTubers doing fundamental novel research into physics and getting paid through Patreon. Examples of this are my own channel and the Dialect YouTube channel. Dialect makes excellent YouTube videos with great visuals where he actually presents novel ideas in physics. So what can you do to continue this positive trend and to benefit from it? First, stop supporting politicians who use force to fund science and those who tax the hell out of the rich. The rich are the ones who disproportionately support the sciences. The more money they have, the better off we're all going to be. And if you are a young intellectual, don't go into academia. Don't join a system that punishes your virtues and rewards your vices. Now, you might be tempted to think, it's fine, James, I'll work my way to the top, and then once I get there, then I'll do the research that I want. I'll do it the way I want to do it. If you have this logic, and I've heard this argument many times before, you're missing something crucial. To succeed in the current system, you're going to have to train yourself to think the way they think. You're going to have to do research and write papers according to their methodology. And if you disagree with that methodology and you still work within the system, you are corrupting your own mind. You are slowly killing the thing that makes you unique and different from others. You are snuffing out the insight latent within you, the insight that only you can give us. If you're in graduate school, go and get your piece of paper and then get out. Start an intellectual career on your own. Teach online like Scott Powell or me. Publish your research online. Find independent donors who can understand what you have to offer and convince them that you are worth supporting. Now, you might give another objection, which I've also heard, which is, Well, but academia has all the equipment I need to actually do my research. Say you're an experimentalist. Now, that might be true for now, but the tide is turning. But here's a far more important point. The most important piece of equipment you need for your scientific research is your mind. And if you compromise its function by training yourself to think like they do, no microscopes or particle colliders will make up for the years you spent training that spark of potential the wrong way. Now, if you're an objectivist intellectual, this is especially important because you know things that most people don't. You are one of the few people who can understand Ayn Rand's revolutionary ideas. And this is exactly the part of your mind you're going to have to hide when trying to impress the entrenched mediocrities. Do not compromise this part of yourself by training yourself to think like your inferiors. Do your intellectual work outside of academia. Now, here's something very important. Once you do break free, don't spend an inordinate amount of your time or effort criticizing the mainstream. If you're pursuing an avenue of research which is being suppressed by the establishment, spend some of your time to convince those who are open-minded to come onto your side. But don't spend time trying to get back at the entrenched mediocrities who you feel wronged by. They don't matter. What does matter is discovering the truth. That's why you became an intellectual to begin with, remember? In the long run, those who are doing research on their own, who aren't suppressed by the establishment, will make the government research irrelevant by simply making more progress and better products than them. What else can you do to speed along and to benefit this trend? Form your own intellectual communities. In physics, this is already happening. This weekend, Dialect is actually announcing the PAMO, the Conference for Physical and Mathematical Ontology. This is a conference for physicists who want to develop theories which prioritize physical cause and effect relationships, breaking free of mainstream physics, which prioritizes floating mathematical abstractions. This conference will be held in Munich in June, and I'll be providing a link in the video description below once I get it. Now, as we form these new institutions of science, we must take care to avoid the following pitfalls. First, we must maintain strict standards of scientific objectivity. This especially means that we have to resist the temptation of a tribalistic us versus them mindset. What does this mean in practice? It means that you shouldn't allow people into your intellectual community just because they're against the status quo like you are. Be warned, the coming collapse of the establishment is going to be capitalized on by charlatans. These people will actually constitute the majority of independent researchers. They're going to hide their bad scientific methodology by making valid criticisms of the mainstream. Be intellectually discerning and focus on positive ideas that these people advocate. What is it that they stand for, as opposed to what do they stand against? It's going to be especially tempting to team up with charlatans when they're influential. Don't let the establishment convince you that science is a popularity contest. Your purpose is to find the truth. Cooperate with people who know the science, not with people who just happen to have a big audience. Another thing to watch out for. Don't accept certain ideas just because they are common among those who reject the status quo. This kind of mistake happened a lot because of the legitimate suspicion people had surrounding the science involving COVID, and I don't want it to happen in physics. So keep these warnings in mind, and in general, put the science first. Don't make this about beating the mainstream. If you are actually right, like you say you are, then you will leave the mainstream in the dust. Now, I want to end this video with some notes of encouragement. If you are an aspiring intellectual, don't join academia. Put your own commitment to truth first. It is better to walk alone in the right direction than to walk with others in the wrong direction. If you stay true to your path, the right people will come into your life. Study under a private researcher. Perhaps find a YouTuber who inspires you. They would be thrilled to mentor you, to pass their knowledge on to you as a student. Now, if you are an independent researcher who's struggling to get recognized, stay strong, keep going. Keep going. If people aren't understanding your ideas, keep trying to communicate them more clearly so that they can understand what you have to offer. Don't get down on yourself or become bitter. Don't focus on your lack of recognition. Instead, give yourself credit for the fact that you had the courage to go outside the norm and to do the work that you knew was right, even though it was unpopular. Don't focus on your hatred for the establishment. Focus on the work that you love and the future it will make possible. And finally, if you are a patron of independent research, thank you. You are paying twice for fundamental research, and you are still happy to pay it. Thank you for paving the way into a better future for free science. If you too would like to become a supporter of independent research in physics, you can support Inductica at patreon.com/Inductica. And I hope you will join me in future videos as this inductive, independent scientific enterprise continues.